Harriet's confession. The moonlight caught Harriet's face, revealing not rage now, but defeat. Her shoulders sagged as Graves snapped the cuffs onto Lionel Trent. The night seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Harriet whispered. He promised me we'd leave before anyone got hurt. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And yet 2 people are dead. Harriet swallowed hard, her voice trembling. It was Lionel's plan. The candle, the timing, the locked study. I only helped because, she stopped, tears threatening. Because I thought I loved him. Trent snarled from the ground. She knew every detail. Don't let her fool you. But Miss Marple did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Harriet, speaking with quiet finality. Love, my dear, is never an excuse for murder. Harriet closed her eyes. Then I suppose you already know where the last candle is hidden. The final candle. Graves hauled Trent to his feet, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. Leave him a moment, Inspector. We must fetch the last candle before someone else does. Harriet's lips trembled. It's in the chapel, behind the altar stone. They moved as one through the cold garden paths, lantern light dancing over frost. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of wax. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers finding a loose slab in the altar's base. With a soft scrape, the stone shifted, revealing a single white candle, thick as a man's wrist, its wick blackened but unburnt. Graves frowned. What's so dangerous about a candle? Miss Marple's eyes were sharp. Because inside its wax is a fuse. Light it, and the whole chapel would have gone up in flames. A hush fell. Outside, the wind sighed against the windows, as if echoing the danger they had narrowly escaped. Miss Marple explains. They gathered in the manor's library, the fire hissing in the grate. Trent sat between 2 constables, his coat torn. Harriet. Pale and silent by the window. Miss Marple began quietly. 3 murders, all tied to one night. The night Lady Redwell discovered Trent's smuggling. He killed her, making it look like a fall, but feared she'd left evidence. Harriet, bound to him by debt and misplaced loyalty, hid the candles, each one containing explosive fuses meant to destroy the ledger. Graves leaned forward. And the lighthouse fire? A diversion, Miss Marple replied. While the village burned, Trent searched the manor, but he missed one candle, the last hidden in the chapel. Without it, his evidence could not be destroyed. Harriet's voice cracked. I thought I was saving him. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. You cannot save a man who will burn the world to hide the truth. The clock chimed midnight. Outside, Marleycone lay still, the storm gone, but its shadows for some would never lift. The man by the greenhouse. Graves rounded the corner first, revolver raised. The lantern clattered to the ground, its light rolling across the gravel in a warm arc, revealing a man in a gardener's coat, his cap pulled low. He bolted toward the orchard, but Miss Marple's voice cut sharply through the night. Stop him, Inspector. That's no gardener. That's Lionel Trent. The name landed like a blow. Graves lunged forward, catching Trent by the collar. The man twisted, his fist connecting with Graves's jaw, but the inspector held fast, forcing him to the ground. From the shadows, Harriet appeared, her pistol raised. Let him go, or I swear. But she didn't finish. Miss Marple had stepped between them, her walking stick thrust against Harriet's wrist with surprising force. The gun dropped into the grass. Enough, Miss Marple said, her eyes cold. The game is over. The moonlit pursuit. The garden lay bathed in cold silver light, every hedge casting deep pools of shadow. Somewhere beyond the yew maze, footsteps crunched over gravel, quick and purposeful. Graves kept low, his revolver drawn. Miss Marple followed, at a measured pace, her eyes sweeping the ground. She paused to note a fresh smear of wax on the flagstones. A trail, faint but deliberate. "She's marking her path," Miss Marple murmured. "Not for herself, but for someone else. Someone waiting." A low whistle drifted through the night. Graves froze, every muscle taut. From behind the old greenhouse came the faint glint of metal. A lantern being shielded, then unshielded, twice in succession. A signal. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "There's your proof, Inspector. She's not just fleeing. She's meeting an accomplice." The lantern vanished. The footsteps quickened, and the chase was on. Chaos in the dark, the room plunged into blackness. Harriet's gasp was sharp, followed by the scrape of a chair and the shuffle of hurried feet. Graves lunged toward the sound, but the pistol barked once, the muzzle flash a split-second flare in the dark. Plaster showered down from the wall inches from his head. Miss Marple did not move. She listened. The scent of candle smoke mingled now with something acrid. Gunpowder. Then came the unmistakable creak of the side door's hinges. "Making for the garden," Miss Marple whispered. Graves was already moving, but Miss Marple's hand caught his sleeve. "Not yet. She'll expect you to follow. Let her run. She'll lead us to what she's been hiding all along." Somewhere outside, a fox barked. The night swallowed the sound, and Harriet Vale. The trap spring's the click echoed in the stillness like a pistol shot. Graves froze, his hand hovering above the parchment. From the shadows stepped Harriet Vale. Her face was calm, almost tender, but her eyes glittered with malice. In one hand, a small pistol. In the other, a taper burning with steady flame. "You've always underestimated me, Inspector," she said softly. "But you, Miss Marple, you saw me the moment you arrived." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "It was the candle, my dear. No housekeeper would leave one burning so low unless she wanted the wax to drip exactly where it would be noticed." Harriet's smile was thin. "Very good, but you're too late. This parchment is the deed to Marleycombe Hall. When the wax seal hardens, it's done, and with one more stroke of my pen, no one will ever prove what happened to poor Lady Clementine." Graves tensed, ready to lunge. Miss Marple's eyes never left Harriet. "The trouble with plans that run by, candlelight," she said, "is that they can be blown out." And with one sharp breath, she did just that. The hall in darkness, the carriage rattled through the winding lanes, its lantern casting long, uneasy shadows over the hedgerows. Marleycombe Hall loomed ahead, black against the moon, every window dark. Graves muttered, "Looks deserted." Miss Marple's knitting bag was on her lap, but the needles inside were not for knitting tonight. "No, Inspector. She's here, and she's expecting us. That's why the lights are out. Darkness is her ally." As they stepped into the silent hall, a faint smell reached them. Candle smoke. Fresh. Miss Marple bent to the flagstones, touching the still warm pool of wax. "She's been here moments ago." This way. They followed the trail to the study, where a single candle burned low. On the desk lay a sheet of parchment, the red seal still soft. Graves reached for it, but Miss Marple's hand shot out. "Careful. That's not a letter." From the corner of the room came a slow, deliberate click. A name like a thunderclap. The voice from the shadows was barely audible, but the name it uttered struck like a lightning bolt in the silence. Harriet Vale. Inspector Graves stared as if the word had claws. The housekeeper? Impossible. She served the family for 30 years. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. And in those 30 years, she learned every secret that passed through those doors. She knew which ones were worth keeping, and which could destroy lives. The fugitive's shoulders sagged. "I never meant for it to happen," he muttered. "She said she only wanted to scare her, make her sign the deed. But when I saw the blood," Graves stepped forward, But Miss Marple held up a hand. "No, Inspector. If this is true, arresting him now will only alert Harriet. And if I'm correct, she's not running. She's waiting." "Waiting?" Graves demanded. Miss Marple's eyes hardened. "Yes, because the final piece of her plan will be carried out before sunrise." The message in wax. Miss Marple took the candlestick from Graves, holding it as though it were a fragile relic. "Notice the wax," she said quietly. "It's not candle wax alone. It's mixed with sealing wax. And sealing wax," she added, glancing at the ledger, "is used to close letters." The fugitive snarled, but Miss Marple pressed on. "This red wax came from a letter sent to the victim on the night of her death. A letter meant to warn her, but she never opened it." Graves frowned. "A warning? From who?" Miss Marple set the candlestick on the table, her eyes glinting. "From the very person who's been blackmailing half of Marleycombe. They wanted her frightened, not dead, but someone else. Someone with more to lose. Made certain the warning became a weapon." The fugitive's face blanched. Miss Marple's voice was almost kind as she concluded, "And that is why you hid the candlestick here. Not because you killed her, but because you knew who did." From the shadows, a single name was whispered, and Graves stiffened. Behind the iron door, Inspector Graves pressed his shoulder to the heavy iron door. It groaned open, spilling them into a low, brick-lined chamber. The air was colder here, heavy with mildew and something far more sinister, the unmistakable. Tang of decay, dot against the far wall, stood a crude wooden table. On it lay bundles of yellowed papers, a cracked leather ledger, and a small wooden box. Miss Marple stepped forward, her candlelight dancing over the items. She opened the ledger. Page after page of names, dates, and amounts. "Blackmail," she whispered. "Years of it." Graves lifted the box's lid. Inside, neatly wrapped in oilcloth, was the silver candlestick from Marleycombe Hall, its wax still clinging to the holder. Only this time, the wax was streaked. Dark red. A sound echoed from deeper in the shadows. A shuffle, then a sharp intake of breath. Graves spun, torch beam catching the fugitive's face at last. Nowhere left to run. The inspector barked. Miss Marple didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the candlestick. "This," she said softly, "is the key to everything, but it's not what you think." The passage below, the man lunged for the trapdoor, wrenched it open, and vanished into the darkness below. Miss Marple stepped forward, peering into the yawning hole. The smell rose first, damp earth and something metallic like rust. Or blood. A rope ladder swayed gently. She waited just long enough for Inspector Graves to arrive, and followed down, her sensible shoes landing on the cold, packed soil of a narrow tunnel. The light from above dimmed to nothing as the trapdoor thudded. Shut. Only the glow of the candle in her hand kept the blackness at bay. Somewhere ahead, footsteps splashed in shallow water. The walls pressed close, rough stone scraping her sleeve. Graves's voice echoed behind her. "Careful, Miss Marple. This place could collapse." She smiled faintly. "Which is exactly why he thinks we won't follow." The tunnel twisted and dropped sharply, opening into a cavern lined with crates, old tools, and a heavy iron door. Fresh scrape marks told her it had been opened recently. From the other side came a muffled clang, followed by silence. Miss Marple held the candle higher. Its flame swayed, pointing toward the faint draft escaping through the iron door. "He's close," she murmured. "And he's cornered." The candle's shadow, the night air, tore at Miss Marple's cheeks as she followed the echo of boots through Marleycombe's twisting lanes. The mist clung to the cobbles, swirling under the glow of solitary lamps. Ahead, the fleeing man's silhouette darted between cottages, always just far enough to tempt pursuit. Then sudden stillness. She slowed, ears straining. Somewhere nearby, a hinge creaked. Not the high pitch of a cottage door, but the deep, slow groan of old wood barn doors. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She found it moments later, the crumbling rectory barn, its loft window spilling the faintest flicker of yellow light. Inside, the smell of candle wax was unmistakable. The man was there, crouched by a battered desk, rummaging through papers with frantic urgency. On the desk stood the candle, the same candle Constable Fry had spoken of. But its flame seemed strange, unnaturally steady despite the drafty room. You never realized, Miss Marple said from the doorway, that the candle gave you away every single time. Wax strips tell a most revealing story, you know. He froze, the papers slipping from his hands. Footsteps thundered outside as officers surrounded the barn. The man's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to a trap door at the far side of the loft. Miss Marple's gaze followed. She had guessed it might come to this. The fog breaks, the blow was raised again. Constable Fry, half conscious, was slumped against the workshop wall. The driver sprawled at his feet. Miss Marple's heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that one more second of hesitation would seal two men's fates. She stepped forward into the mist, her cane tapping once on the cobbles, a sound sharp enough to make the hooded figure freeze. "That will do," she said, her voice low but firm. "We've had quite enough killing for one lifetime, haven't we?" The figure turned. Beneath the hood, a face she recognized. Not a stranger, but a man from the village fete who'd claimed to be too lame to walk far. His eyes widened, caught between rage and calculation. "You don't know what you've seen," he growled. "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple replied. "And so will the police in approximately 30 seconds, if my young friend keeps to his word." From the mist came the distant clatter of boots' reinforcements at last. The hooded man tensed, weighing his chances, then bolted into the fog. Fry tried to rise, but Miss Marple held him still. "Let him run," she said softly. "We know where the path ends." And somewhere beyond the mist, a single candle still burned in the old Marleycombe rectory, waiting to light the way to the truth. Mist without mercy, the cart creaked to a halt outside the derelict workshop, its doors sagging on rusted hinges. The driver hopped down, muttering to the shadowy figure who had joined him. Miss Marple, keeping her distance, could see their silhouettes. Through the curling mist, two men, both tense, both glancing over their shoulders as if the darkness itself might pounce. From her left, Constable Fry edged closer to the workshop wall, his breath clouding in the cold. He had almost reached the door when a sharp metallic click shattered the quiet. A padlock snapped shut from the inside. "Too late," Miss Marple murmured under her breath. Suddenly, the mist shifted. Not by wind, but by movement a third. Figure stepping from behind the hedgerow. Tall, hooded, and carrying something heavy and blunt. In the same moment, the driver's voice rose in alarm, then cut off in a muffled grunt. Fry lunged forward, but the hooded figure swung first. The constable staggered, his cap flying into the fog. Miss Marple took a step, then stopped. She was not here to fight. She was here to see. And in that brief pause, she saw the truth. The hooded figure was not here to protect the cargo. He was here to silence both men. The mist was no longer just hiding the crime. It was swallowing the witnesses whole. The cart in the mist rolled in thick as milk over Marleycombe's cobbles, swallowing the glow of the street lamps. Miss Marple kept to the shadows, her footsteps soundless against the damp stones. Ahead, the cart's wheels groaned under their load, guided by the man she had been quietly watching for days. She knew the crates well enough by now. Wax candles on the outside, stolen relics within. The very heart of the vicarage theft. From an alleyway, a darker shadow detached itself. Constable Fry crouched low, his cap pulled down. At Miss Marple's small nod, he began to follow the cart at a measured distance. The driver quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder, suspicion flickering. The road narrowed at the edge of town, where high hedgerows muffled sound. Here, Miss Marple stopped, leaning lightly on her walking stick. She didn't need to go further. She knew exactly where the road ended, at an abandoned candle workshop by the marsh, the perfect place to stash contraband. And sure enough, the cart turned that way. Fry slipped after it like a shadow. Then, from the mist ahead, another set of footsteps, quick, urgent. A figure emerged, whispering sharply to the driver. For a moment, the words were lost in the fog, but the tone carried fear. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. There was another player in the game. Someone who feared what? The driver knew, or what he might say. Wax and wire, the rain had not let up by the time Miss Marple returned to the parlor of the Red Lion. Her knitting sat in its basket beside the fire, but her hands were far too busy for wool. Instead, she sat with a scrap of brown paper and an old fountain pen, writing a short but precise note. Mrs. Alder hovered nearby. "You're not going to the police already?" "Oh, not yet," Miss Marple said, folding the paper neatly. "The police are like bread best called for when everything is ready to be served. At present, my dough still needs proving." She slipped the note into an envelope and handed it to Mrs. Alder. "This goes to young Constable Fry, no one else. He is to hide himself near the back entrance of the inn tonight. If any boxes are moved, he is to follow them quietly." Mrs. Alder's eyes widened. "You think he'll try to take them tonight?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Men in trouble rarely sleep well with evidence under their own roof. That evening, she made a point of sitting in the common room where her quarry could see her, seemingly lost in harmless chatter with the other guests. Every so often, she would glance toward the bar, where he polished glasses with mechanical precision. The air between them hummed with an unspoken game of patience. Near midnight, she retired to her room. But she did not undress. Instead, she sat by her window, the curtains drawn just enough to watch the yard below. The minutes stretched, and then movement. A figure slipped from the cellar door, a crate hugged close to his chest. Another trip, another box, each one placed into the back of a waiting cart. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched beside her. She didn't need yarn tonight. She had a trail. A candle's flame burns both ways. The man blocking the doorway stepped forward, his boots scraping against the cellar steps. The dim light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the faint sheen of rain on his coat. "You shouldn't be down here," he said softly, though the softness carried more warning than courtesy. Miss Marple clasped her hands primly, as if she'd been caught inspecting the scone supply rather than a cache of incriminating goods. "Curiosity is a terrible fault of mine," she said, "but it has a habit of saving lives. Yours might yet be one of them." His eyes narrowed. "You think I'm in danger?" "I know you are," she replied, tilting her head toward the workbench. "The sort of people who hide accounts and candles rarely leave loose ends. And, my dear, you are most certainly a loose end." For a heartbeat, his composure faltered. He glanced toward the crates, then back at her. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." "Oh, I think I do," she said mildly. "A murder staged with a single candle burning. A shipment of more such candles ready to be moved. And a trail that leads directly to the Red Lion." A flicker of movement on the stairs above caught her eye. Mrs. Alder, wide-eyed, clutching a basket as if it might shield her. The man didn't notice. Miss Marple's voice lightened. "Perhaps," she said, "you'd care to walk me upstairs. I should hate to stumble in the dark and knock something over." Like a box of evidence. The man hesitated, calculating. Then, with a curt nod, he stepped aside. "After you, Miss Marple." She ascended with unhurried grace, her mind already working. She had no doubt he would try to remove the crates before nightfall, and she had every intention of ensuring that when he did, someone would be watching. What the cellar held, the rain had turned the cobbled lane into a glistening ribbon by the time Miss Marple returned to the Red Lion the next afternoon. She had chosen her moment carefully. Mr. Trevelyan was out delivering an order to the vicarage, and Mrs. Alder had discreetly left the back door unlatched. The cellar door stood at the far end of the corridor, its iron lock recently oiled. Miss Marple knelt, peering at the floor. The faint outline of muddy boot prints led to the door and stopped abruptly, as though the wearer had stood there a moment too long. She slipped the key quietly borrowed from Mrs. Alder into the lock. It turned with a low click. A wave of cool, damp air met her as the door creaked open. The smell was faintly metallic, not the yeasty comfort of ale barrels. Miss Marple descended slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Rows of shelves lined the walls, but they held no bottles or casks. Instead, stacked neatly along one side, were boxes, heavy wooden crates with shipping labels half scraped away. She lifted the lid of one. Inside lay candles, dozens of them, all identical to the one found burning at the scene of the murder. On a small workbench lay a single candle, cut open down the center. Miss Marple leaned closer. The hollowed interior had been stuffed with folded slips of paper, each covered in fine handwriting. She plucked one free and read the top line. Amounts received, names omitted. Her lips tightened. These were no ordinary candles. They were being used to pass messages, perhaps payments, under the guise of harmless church supplies. A faint creak on the floorboards above made her pause. Someone else had entered the inn. She closed the lid, replaced the paper, and reached the stairs just as a shadow fell across the doorway. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" The voice was smooth, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. She turned slowly, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, only the truth, my dear," she said. The man at the door did not smile. An evening of confessions. The sitting room at the Red Lion Inn was unusually quiet for a Saturday evening. Outside, a faint drizzle streaked the windows, and inside, the low fire cast long, wavering shadows across the floorboards. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting bag at her side, though the needles lay idle in her lap. She had been listening, just listening, for nearly an hour. At a nearby table, Inspector Graves leaned over a cup of coffee, deep in conversation with George Pritchard, the church warden. George's voice was hushed, but carried an unmistakable urgency. "I told you, Inspector, that man had no business wandering near the vicarage that night," George said. "And I saw him clear as day heading toward the rectory garden gate just before the candle went out." Miss Marple did not look at them directly, but her mind stored away the detail like a pin in a map. The candle, the garden gate, the timing, it all stitched itself into the quiet fabric of her thoughts. Mrs. Alder, the innkeeper's wife, came bustling in with a tray, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen's heat. She paused when she saw Miss Marple. "You know, dear, it's the strangest thing," Mrs. Alder began, setting down a plate of scones. "Mr. Trevelyan's been acting queer ever since that night. Won't look me in the eye, mutters to himself when he thinks no one's about. And then there's the business with the cellar." "The cellar?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was a light in her eyes. Mrs. Alder glanced around, as if the very walls might overhear. "He's been locking it every night. And not for the ale, I can tell you that. There's something down there he doesn't want found." Miss Marple merely nodded, but inside she felt a tightening of the thread. People often thought secrets were hidden in whispers, but she knew they were more often hidden in actions. What a person did differently when they thought no one noticed. By the time the evening wound down, She had heard enough. George's sighting, Mrs. Alder's suspicions, and the peculiar business of the cellar. None of it pointed directly to the murderer, yet each detail made the false picture drawn by the police wobble ever so slightly. Outside, the drizzle had become a steady rain. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the night, her mind quietly rearranging the puzzle. Somewhere in those half-confessions and guarded glances lay the truth, and she meant to find it before the village settled on the wrong name forever. The quiet confession herald sat heavily in the vestry chair, his hands gripping the satchel as though it might protect him. Miss Marple stood opposite, the lamplight catching the faint glint of her knitting needles peeking from her coat pocket. An oddly homely sight in the midst of such tension. "It wasn't my idea," Harold blurted. "It was hers." She said no one would notice, that the old tea set wasn't even worth much. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "Mrs. Elkins." His eyes widened. "You knew?" "I suspected," she replied. "You see, it takes a certain kind of nerve to play host at a parish tea while quietly arranging for valuables to vanish. The missing parish ledger was merely her insurance, proof of debts owed, tucked away in case she needed persuasion." Harold swallowed hard. She said it was only borrowing, just until she settled something with the vicar. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Borrowing, my dear, is when one asks permission. Taking without it is rather a different thing." Footsteps echoed outside, and the vicar appeared in the doorway, dressing down, flapping in the draught. "Miss Marple? I thought I heard voices." "Oh." His eyes fell on the open satchel, and his jaw tightened by the time the clock chimed midnight. The matter was neatly arranged, the tea set returned to the church cupboard, the ledger replaced in its drawer, and Harold walking home under the vicar's watchful eye. As for Mrs. Elkins, she was said to have left on the early train next morning, bound for a rest with a sister in Devon, though nobody in St. Mildred's believed that for a moment. Miss Marple returned to her own neat parlor, put the kettle on, and resumed her knitting. The night had been brisk, but the village would sleep soundly again, and as she sipped her tea, she thought, not without a hint of satisfaction, that sometimes the smallest observations were enough to unravel the most careful of schemes. The hasty move that evening, St. Mildred's village lay under a pale moon, the streets empty save for the soft sweep of wind through the hedgerows. Most windows were dark by 9, except for the one in Miss Marple's bedroom, where a faint lamplight glowed. She sat by it with her knitting, though her eyes were not on the yarn. Earlier at tea, she had watched 3 people pretend not to hear the vicar's remark about the box. Pretense, she knew, never held for long. So she kept her curtains just slightly parted, and her ears tuned to the quiet dot. It was 10:30 when she heard it, a quick, uneven footstep on the lane. Peering out, she caught sight of a figure, moving fast, shoulders hunched, glancing left and right. It was Harold Fenton. In one hand he clutched a canvas satchel. The other kept fumbling at his coat pocket. Instead of heading home, he turned up the narrow path behind the church. Miss Marple's mouth tightened ever so slightly. That path, she knew, led to the vestry door, and beyond it, the locked cupboard where certain parish records were kept. She slipped on her coat and hat, moving with the practiced quiet of a woman who has spent her life in small, creaky houses. Through the churchyard she went, keeping to the yew shadows. The vestry's old oak door was ajar, just enough to show a slice of light within. Harold was inside, rifling through a drawer. His satchel gaped open on a chair, revealing a leather-bound ledger and what looked suspiciously like a bundle wrapped in brown paper dot. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "Looking for something, Mr. Fenton?" He jerked, upright, face drained of color. I was only returning stolen property, I trust," she finished for him. shutting the door with a decisive click. "Do sit down. I should like to hear exactly how you came by it." Somewhere in the nave, the clock began to chime 11. It was going to be a long night. The gathering by Monday morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the air sharp and bright. Miss Marple spent the early hours writing short, neat notes in her careful hand. They were all couched in the same language, a harmless invitation to tea. "To discuss the arrangements for the harvest fair," she wrote, as though nothing more were on her mind. One went to Mrs. Penfield, another to Harold Fenton, one to Peter Conway, and most deliberately, one to the vicar himself. She posted them personally, making certain they would arrive together and allow no time for whispered comparisons. The afternoon of the gathering, her little parlor was warm with the scent of scones and freshly brewed tea. The lace cloth was spotless, the chairs arranged so that no one could sit too far from anyone else. Miss Marple's knitting lay in its basket beside her armchair, untouched. She was ready to watch, not to stitch. Mrs. Penfield arrived first, cheeks flushed from mou. The walk, carrying a jar of damson jam for the fair. Harold Fenton came next, hat in hand, eyes darting around the room as though weighing the distance to the door. Peter Conway followed, stiff with an unconvincing air of good cheer. The vicar was last, apologizing for being delayed by Parrish. Matters, his voice just a shade too formal. They talked at first of ordinary things, the fair, the weather, a recent letter in the local paper about potholes. Miss Marple listened, smiling, pouring tea with the precision of a chemist measuring a volatile mixture. Then, in a tone of idle recollection, she said, "Funny how Mrs. Pritchard's box was found so close to the vestry door. Almost as if someone had meant to leave it there for safekeeping." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Penfield's teaspoon clinked against her saucer. Harold's eyes fixed suddenly on the tablecloth. Peter's jaw tightened. But it was the vicar who spoke first, with a careful call. "Yes, though perhaps the box was never meant to be found at all." That remark hung in the air for a beat too long. Harold shifted in his chair, muttering something about misunderstandings, while Peter reached for his teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, then briskly asked if anyone would like more scones. They all said no. She simply smiled and reached for her knitting. The first stitch slid from needle to needle, the sound of a net drawing quietly, inexorably closed. The net begins to tighten Sunday morning brought a fine drizzle, the sort that made the village green look like a watercolor painting. The church was fuller than usual. Death, Miss Marple had long observed, often made people more devout, at least. For a week or two, from her usual place halfway down the left-hand aisle, she took in the congregation with her knitting needle eye. Harold Fenton was there, sitting unusually far back, his gaze fixed not on the altar, but on the floor. Peter Conway had not come at all, and the vicar looked as though he'd been carrying some heavy, private burden. After the service, Miss Marple allowed herself to be drawn into the slow-moving knot of villagers outside the church door. She spoke, first to Mrs. Penfield, asking after her roses in a tone that suggested nothing more serious than concern for aphids. Yet in between the talk of mildew and pruning, Miss Marple casually mentioned the curious fact of the box having been found empty. Mrs. Penfield's eyes flickered sideways, just for a moment, toward Harold Fenton. Noted. Next, she approached. "The vicar. Such a moving sermon," she said warmly. "I suppose you must have had Mrs. Pritchard very much in mind." The vicar's hands tightened on his Bible. "Yes. She was a strong presence in our parish. Sometimes too strong." His eyes, unbidden, darted toward the vestry door, the same door where the pale yellow wax smear had been. Noted again. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had paid a visit to Mrs. Fletcher under the pretext of returning a borrowed recipe. The postmistress, always eager for a confidant, declared she knew exactly why Peter Conway was avoiding the village. It's guilt, my dear Jane, pure guilt. But when Miss Marple leaned in and said, almost idly, or perhaps fear, Mrs. Fletcher blinked rapidly and looked away. Fear, Miss Marple knew, was often the more accurate word. Her last conversation of the day was with Harold Fenton himself. She found him at his garden gate, fiddling with a latch that clearly needed no adjustment. "You were so quick to help." "At the harvest supper," she remarked cheerfully. "I expect Mrs. Pritchard appreciated such attentions." "She didn't appreciate anything I did," he said shortly. "If she had, she wouldn't have." He stopped, swallowed, and forced a tight smile. "Never mind." His voice had an edge, the kind people get when they realize they've almost said too much. As Miss Marple walked home through the drizzle, she turned the day's observations over in her mind. 3 people, at least, were keeping something from the police, and each, in their own way, had betrayed themselves when the subject of the candle, the box, or Mrs. Pritchard was raised. The trick, she knew, was to let them think their secrets were still safe. For now, because soon she would need to draw them into the open, and once the net was ready, there would be no slipping free. A second shock Saturday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning when the sun turned every frost-tipped hedge into a sparkle of diamonds. It should have been a cheerful day. The market was in full swing in Much Harrow, and the church bells were due to ring for the midday wedding of a young couple from Elmsworth. But by 9 o'clock, Marleycombe had something far more pressing to discuss. It was Mrs. Fletcher, naturally, who delivered the news to Miss Marple, breathless from the speed of her walk to the old vicarage. "They've found it," she announced without preamble. "Mrs. Pritchard's box, the one with the letters. Only," she paused for effect, "it wasn't in her house at all. It was in the church, hidden behind the altar cloth." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "How curious." "Curious? It's downright suspicious. And here's the queer part. It was empty. Not a scrap of paper inside." By mid-morning, Inspector Graves had stationed himself outside St. Mildred's, fielding questions from both the curious and the self-appointed helpful villagers. He confirmed only that the box had been found during a routine search, and that it was indeed Mrs. Pritchard's property. He would not comment on its contents, or lack thereof. Miss Marple, walking slowly along the path by the churchyard wall, noted that Harold Fenton was nowhere to be seen. Nor was Peter Conway, though Mrs. Penfield claimed she'd seen him cycling toward Much Harrow at first light. The vicar, however, looked pale and preoccupied, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he moved between the vestry and the nave. Just after noon, a new ripple of excitement passed through the village. Someone had been in the church during the night. The verger had noticed scuff marks on the vestry floor that hadn't been there before, and a candlestick, not the one beside Mrs. Pritchard, but its pair from the opposite side of the altar, had been moved. Miss Marple went into the church herself that afternoon. The air was colder than usual, and a faint smell of extinguished candle lingered. She looked at the altered candlestick and noted something Inspector Graves had apparently missed: a small, hardened droplet of pale yellow wax clinging to the inside of the brass cup. The same old wax as before. It was then she saw the second twist, or perhaps the first sign of a bigger pattern. At the base of the candlestick, almost hidden by the carved wood of the altar rail, was a scrap of cloth. It was dark blue serge, neatly hemmed, torn from something larger. A uniform, perhaps, or a man's coat. She slipped it into her glove and left the church without drawing attention. Outside, the village green looked as it always did: children playing, an old man feeding the ducks. But to Miss Marple, the stillness was deceiving. Something had shifted in the undercurrent of Marleycombe. Mrs. Pritchard's death was no longer a single, isolated act. Someone was still moving in the shadows, and the candle that wouldn't die had not finished casting its light. Old wounds resurfaced the next morning broke damp and gray, with a thin mist lying low over the green. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke, and the rooftops were slick with dew. Marleycombe, for all its outward charm, seemed to hold its breath. Marple had planned to spend the morning quietly with her knitting, but fate, in the form of Mrs. Penfield, had other ideas. She appeared at the front gate, clutching a bundle of newspapers, her voice already pitched to the level of confidential urgency. "You'll never believe it, Jane," she began, before even being invited in. "I've heard from my cousin in Elmsworth, she knows one of the constables there, that Mrs. Pritchard was threatening to expose someone. Something about letters." Mrs. Penfield's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the forbiddens. Apparently, she had a whole packet of them, kept in a locked box in her sitting room. The police couldn't find it. Miss Marple poured tea and listened politely, though her mind was already turning over the possibilities. Letters could mean almost anything: business dealings, romantic indiscretions, family quarrels. In a village like Marleycombe, any one of those could be deadly. Later that afternoon, on her way back from the grocer's, she took the long route past the Red Hart. Through the half-open window of the private parlor, she caught the low murmur of two voices: Harold Fenton's, tight with irritation, and the vicar's, sounding uncharacteristically severe. "She had no right to threaten you, Harold," the vicar said. "That's all very well for you to say," Fenton replied. "But if she'd told anyone about—" He stopped abruptly, as if aware the words were dangerous. There was a pause, then the scrape of a chair and the sound of footsteps moving. Away from the window dot, Miss Marple walked on, her face as placid as ever, though her mind was alert. So Harold had secrets too. And perhaps not only Harold. Mrs. Pritchard, for all her faults, had always prided herself on knowing the truth. About people. It seemed she had known too much for her own good. That evening, Miss Marple visited the church again, under the pretext of delivering a small arrangement of chrysanthemums for the altar. She found Inspector Graves there, going through the vestry. With his sergeant, he looked up briefly. "Evening, Miss Marple. Still curious about our candle?" "Curious, yes," she said mildly, "but more about people than candles, I think." She set the flowers down, her eyes drifting over the space. Something had changed. On the shelf above the cupboard where the brass polish was kept, there was a faint rectangle of dust, the shape left when an object had been removed. A box, perhaps, just the right size to hold a bundle of letters. As she left the church, the mist had thickened, and the lamplight turned it into a soft golden haze. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed sharply. The village was settling into its night, but Miss Marple knew that behind its drawn curtains, old grudges and hidden fears were stirring. This murder was not the work of chance. It was rooted deep in the soil of Marleycombe, in secrets that had been waiting for years to be unearthed. The wrong Manby Thursday morning, the mood in Marleycombe had shifted. The shock of Mrs. Pritchard's death had begun to settle into something sharper, curiosity tinged with a certain satisfaction. The village wanted answers, and nothing pleased it more than hearing that the police had found someone to blame. The someone in question was Peter Conway. It began with a whisper in the Red Hart. By noon, Mrs. Fletcher was recounting it at the post office, lowering her voice in a way that ensured everyone leaned in closer. By 3 o'clock, even the vicar's housemaid happened to pass the bakery just in time to hear Mrs. Penfield declare, "Well, I always said there was something shifty about that boy." The facts, such as they were, seemed straightforward. Peter had been seen near the church on the night of Mrs. Pritchard's death, lurking, as Mrs. Penfield put it. He had quarreled with her only a week before, after she accused him of taking a prayer book. And most damning of all, Inspector Graves had discovered that Peter had recently borrowed a small sum of money from Harold Fenton and had not repaid it. Pressure makes a man desperate, the blacksmith remarked knowingly over his pint. And desperate men do foolish things. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had seen Peter in the alley that morning after the murder, yes, but his manner had been furtive rather than guilty, as if he were hiding something embarrassing, not murderous. And she remembered that quarrel with Mrs. Pritchard. Peter had looked more wounded than angry, the way a boy might when unjustly accused. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the Conway lodgings, ostensibly to bring Mrs. Conway some plum jam. Peter's mother, a thin woman with anxious eyes, welcomed her warmly enough. Peter himself appeared a few minutes later, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking both wary and defensive. "They say you were near the church on Tuesday night," Miss Marple said, her tone as mild as if she were remarking on the weather. Peter flushed. I was meeting someone." "Oh?" He hesitated. "It's not what you think. I promised I wouldn't say who. But I didn't go inside the church. I swear it." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes keeping a promise can be more dangerous than breaking it. When she left, she took a slow route home past Mill Lane. There, at the edge of the hedgerow, she saw something curious. A small fragment of candle wax, pale yellow, lying half hidden in the grass. She crouched, difficult in her tweeds, and picked it up with her handkerchief. The same brittle texture, the same shade as the wax in the church Vestry. By evening, word had spread that Inspector Graves intended to question Peter more formally. The village felt vindicated. The wrongs of Mrs. Pritchard, it seemed, were about to be righted. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her parlor, was troubled. The evidence against Peter was built of gossip, half-truths, and assumptions. And gossip, she knew, was a poor foundation for justice. Somewhere in the folds of the truth lay the real reason for that stubborn, flickering candle, and the person who had lit it. The silent witness by the following day, the frost had melted into a thin, silvery dampness, the kind that seemed to cling to the skin. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warmest cardigan and a sturdy tweed coat, set out toward St. Mildred's just after morning coffee. She had no official reason to be there, but in a village like Marleycombe, the line between official and social was easily blurred. The church stood at the highest point of the village, a gray-stoned building with a squat bell tower and a small, neatly kept graveyard. The lich gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the air inside the churchyard was still, almost too still, as if it were holding its breath. She found the door unlocked, though the police had cordoned off part of the chancel with a length of thin rope. There was no one inside at first, only the faint smell of candle wax and something sharper, the faint tang of metal. Blood, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the chancel. It was an ordinary space, really. Worn prayer books stacked neatly on the lectern, the brass candlesticks gleaming in the dim light. But near the altar rail she saw it. The candle it stood in a plain brass holder, thick and white, its wax running only slightly down one side. The wick was blackened, but short, as if it had burned for no more than 20 minutes. And there, on the wooden floor just beside the candle, was a small droplet of something dark and dried. Not blood, she was quite sure of that, but wax, and not from the candle in the holder. This wax was pale yellow, brittle, and clearly older. Her eyes moved to the kneeler by the altar rail. It had been pushed slightly out of place, and there was a faint scuff mark on the stone beneath, the kind made by a shoe sliding under pressure. A woman's shoe, judging by its narrowness. She made a mental note. Footsteps behind her broke the silence. Miss Marple. The voice was brisk, but not unfriendly. Inspector Graves stood in the aisle, his hat in one hand. "I shouldn't be surprised. You've a knack for finding your way into things." "I came to say a prayer," she said mildly. One ought, in times such as these. Graves gave a half-smile. "And did your prayers reveal the culprit?" "Oh, no," she said, looking at the candle. "Only that people sometimes do the strangest things when they think no one is watching." He followed her gaze. "That, likely lit by whoever found her. Shock can make people act oddly." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I wonder who would come into a cold church and think first of lighting a candle." As she left the church, she paused at the vestry door. There was a faint smear just at the edge of the brass handle, so faint it might have been missed entirely. A waxy smear, pale yellow like the droplet near the altar. She touched it lightly with her glove. Handon thought again of Mrs. Pritchard lying in the chancel, and of the man she had seen hurrying away 2 nights ago. Out in the churchyard, the winter light fell flat upon the gravestones, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Miss Marple began her walk home, knitting together these small scraps in her mind. They were nothing yet, just threads. But in her experience, threads had a way of leading to the whole cloth. Whispers and shadows by the following morning, Marleycombe was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. At the grocer's, 2 women were bending over the vegetable counter, voices low but eyes bright with curiosity. At the post office, customers lingered, far longer than usual, as though each was waiting to hear or be heard. The ordinary hum of village life had shifted. Every conversation circled back to the same subject, that Mrs. Agatha Pritchard, dead in the church. And that candle dot, it was remarkable how quickly the story changed, depending on who told it. By the time Mrs. Fletcher repeated it to her second cousin's wife, the candle was no longer simply burning. It had been dripping blood-red wax, a detail that made her audience gasp in delicious horror. At the Red Hart, George Harwood insisted he had heard from a reliable source that Mrs. Pritchard's handbag was missing entirely, though by tea-time the handbag had been found untouched in the vestry cupboard. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was making her usual morning rounds. She stopped first at the bakery, not for bread, which she had bought the day before, but for a few scones while they were fresh. From there, she strolled to the high street, exchanging polite greetings, her expression mild and interested. People spoke freely to Miss Marple. She had the comforting air of someone who not only listened, but remembered. Outside the post office, she encountered Mrs. Penfield, bundled in her green wool coat, eyes darting this way and that. "A dreadful business, Jane," Mrs. Penfield sighed, clutching her shopping basket as though the news might somehow be contagious. "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, her voice calm. "Did you know Mrs. Pritchard well?" Mrs. Penfield hesitated, then leaned in. "Well enough to say she wasn't a woman to make friends easily." "But enemies?" "Oh, my dear, half the village could have had cause." She glanced over her shoulder before continuing. "Only last month she had words with the vicar. Accused him of mismanaging the harvest fund. Said it was bordering on fraud, if you can imagine." Miss Marple could imagine. Mrs. Pritchard was famous for her blunt tongue. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" she asked gently. "Unusual?" Mrs. Penfield frowned. "Only that Harold Fenton came out of the church, looking like he'd seen a ghost. But then, he's always looked rather pale, hasn't he?" By mid-morning, Inspector Graves and his sergeant were a common sight, their dark coats moving in and out of doorways. They spoke to the vicar first, then to the verger, and finally to several of the parish committee members. Graves was a tall man with a lined face and a manner that was neither friendly nor unfriendly. He believed in facts, not chatter. Unfortunately for him, Marleycombe was a village of chatter. At 11:30, a small but telling incident occurred. standing by. The green, Miss Marple noticed young Peter Conway slip into the side alley beside the churchyard wall. He looked about him once, twice, then disappeared entirely from view. When he emerged a minute later, he had nothing in his hands, but his manner was oddly taut, like a boy caught doing something he shouldn't. He did not see her watching Dot by. The afternoon, the first official theory had made its way into public conversation. A burglary gone wrong. The police believed Mrs. Pritchard might have surprised an intruder in the church, leading to a fatal struggle. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea and listening to Mrs. Fletcher recount this for the third time, was unconvinced. The church had no signs of forced entry. And besides, burglars did not usually pause to light a candle beside their victim. No, there was something more personal here, something about that candle. In the quiet of her parlor, Miss Marple set down her knitting and allowed herself a small frown. A candle recently lit beside a woman who had been dead for hours. It was not the act of panic or haste. It was deliberate, purposeful. The question was why. A quiet evening in Marleycombeth village of Marleycombe lay like a picture postcard in the soft light of late autumn. The air held the faintest nip of frost, and the winding lanes were lined with cottages whose chimneys sent up gentle curls of smoke. The leaves, russet and gold, clung stubbornly to branches, as though unwilling to give up the last warmth before winter claimed the land. It was a Tuesday evening, the sort of evening when the world seemed very far away from Marleycombe, and life followed the steady rhythm it always had. At the Red Hart, the local inn, the fire had been lit early, and the low murmur of conversation was occasionally punctuated by bursts of laughter. Mr. George Harwood, the landlord, was polishing glasses behind the bar, while Mrs. Fletcher, his postmistress, recounted for the third time how her niece in Exeter had been nearly run down by a motor car got up at St. Mildred's Church Hall. The Women's Guild had just finished their weekly meeting, and ladies in sensible coats and hats were filing out into the chilly dusk, their talk a mixture of recipes, parish news, and mild complaints about the vicar's latest sermon. A little further along the high street, the faint smell of bread wafted from the bakery, where Mr. and Mrs. Hargreaves were stacking the last loaves for the morning delivery. It was, in short, precisely the kind of evening that Miss Jane Marple liked best. From her seat by the parlor window at the old vicarage, a modest but charming cottage at the edge of the village green, she could see the church steeple rising pale against the darkening sky. The knitting needles in her lap clicked gently, though her mind was far from the stocking she was making for her great niece. She had a fond habit, particularly in the evenings, of letting her thoughts wander over the village and its inhabitants, much as one might turn over a familiar patchwork quilt, seeing each piece in its place and remembering its story. There was Mrs. Penfield, for example, a widow of some years and a fierce guardian of her rose garden. Miss Marple had noticed that Mrs. Penfield had lately taken to visiting the grocer's at rather irregular hours, which was unlike her. And young Peter Conway, who worked at the garage, a bright boy, though inclined to brood. He had been walking home very late of late, often by the lane near the old rectory, though his lodgings were in quite the opposite direction to most. These were unimportant scraps of village life, but to Miss Marple they were pieces of a larger pattern. Life in a small place rarely altered without reason. It was nearly 6 o'clock when she heard the church bell. Only one note, the dull single toll that was neither the peal of a wedding nor the cheerful call to evening service. Odd, she thought. It was not the hour for anything in particular. She rose, set aside her knitting, and drew the curtains just enough to peer out. In the gathering dusk, she could see a figure hurrying along the path from the church, a tall man, coat collar turned up, hat pulled low. He moved quickly, head down, and took the side path towards Mill Lane, rather than the main road. Miss Marple could not be certain, but she thought it might be Harold Fenton, the churchwarden. His gait was distinctive, quick, almost impatient. Moment later, the bell tolled again. Just once. The next morning, Marley Combe awoke to a sharp, glistening frost. At the bakery, Mrs. Fletcher leaned over the counter to share the latest piece of news. There had been an incident at St. Mildred's. No one was certain what exactly had happened, only that the vicar had been called in the night, and there was talk of the police being informed. By mid-morning, gossip was winding through the village like ivy. Someone had been found inside the church. Someone dead. Miss Marple, who had just purchased a small loaf, listened without comment. But she had noticed something in Mrs. Fletcher's account, the peculiar way she lowered her voice on the word dead, and the faint satisfaction in being the bearer of such grim tidings. Marley Combe was a quiet place. A murder, if indeed it was murder, would stir the village to its roots. By noon, the truth, or some version of it, was known. It was Mrs. Agatha Pritchard, a long-standing member of the parish committee, and by all accounts, a most difficult woman. She had been found in the chancel, slumped against the altar rail, a candle burning beside her. The curious part, according to Mrs. Harwood at the inn, was that the candle was an old one from the vestry, thick and white, and it had been lit, though no service had been held that evening. And here's the queer thing, Mrs. Harwood confided, leaning across the bar, to Mrs. Fletcher and the blacksmith's wife. That candle, it hadn't burned down hardly at all, as if it had only just been lit, yet she'd been there for hours. By tea-time, the whole village knew that the police had arrived from Much Harrow, the nearest market town, and that Inspector Graves himself was leading the inquiry. Miss Marple, sitting with her tea and seed cake, thought over what she had heard. Mrs. Pritchard had been a woman of strong opinions and stronger dislikes. She had quarreled with the vicar over the redecoration of the church vestry. She had accused young Peter Conway of stealing a prayer book, quite unfairly, in Miss Marple's opinion. And only last week she had been seen in heated conversation with Harold Fenton in the churchyard. The candle. Miss Marple's mind lingered on that detail. Why would someone light a candle beside a dying woman? Or had it been lit after she was already dead? And if so, for what purpose? It was, she thought, rather like those old stories in which a single object, seemingly insignificant, turned out to hold the key to everything. Outside, dusk crept back over the village, and somewhere in the distance the church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple set down her cup and reached for her knitting, but her eyes were far away, fixed not on the plain gray wool, but on the image in her mind, a solitary candle burning in the cold air of St. Mildred's. A candle that, for reasons no one yet understood, refused to die.